Hey everyone, welcome to Office Hours. I am Professor Julian Zelizer. This is the Long View, and this is our weekly get together where you can ask questions through the chat about whatever is on your mind. I did just post in the notes a column, even though I'm taking a little vacation from the foreign policy. I did write a column reviewing a film that's coming out on PBS, The American Experience, about how journalists covered the atomic bomb, the dropping of the bomb, the development of the bomb, the aftermath of the bomb, and really the role of journalists in trying to reveal what had happened, and efforts of the government to stop full accounting, and some journalists following that lead and others not. It's a very interesting documentary, but in foreign policy, I go through it and why it's important and quite relevant to today. And obviously, we are in the middle now, very different, but also another foreign policy moment. So that is out this morning. You can catch that, read that on Foreign Policy. Tomorrow, my newsletter will come out, and it will be about January 6th, given we are commemorating an anniversary of that terrible moment in American history. So, anyway, those are the two announcements. We have a bunch of great guests coming up on Friday, by the way, and start sending the chat questions, and I will get to them in a second. We have Charlie Sykes, a favorite from To the Contrary, will be joining me at 11:30. John and Alter and I will be doing that. And now at 12, I'm going to be talking to Sam Tannenhouse, who's been on The Long View, to talk about his book about William Buckley. We're going to be discussing a recent op-ed he wrote about Mayor Mamdani in New York and what he represents politically and culturally. And then an author, Ben Ashfield, who wrote a really, really interesting and highly original book about the arson in the Bronx in the 1970s, and a really kind of revisionist account of what happened, really an iconic element of that. So those are all the issues and guests who are on tap. It should be a great Friday, and I hope a lot of you can join for some of those live conversations. Finally, tomorrow for paid subscribers, I'll be doing In the Classroom, probably around 10 o'clock. Once again, that time seemed to be good, and it works for me this week. I haven't picked the topic, but I will pick that later today. But we should have a good time. We had a great turnout last week, and I really enjoyed that. Anyway, questions. I know lots of issues are on your mind. Obviously, for many people, they're thinking of January 6th and the kind of implications of that moment in American history and where we are today. A lot of, I just saw a few lines up, a comment on Venezuela, which is clearly the news story of the weekend, and a very significant event, as we now have a foreign leader here in Brooklyn under detention, about to be prosecuted. And the comparison many people have talked about is Panama in 1989, when President George H.W. Bush also undercut and captured Noriega, who was then the head of Panama, based on drug charges. Obviously, hi, good morning, M. Layfield. The size, the scale and scope of Venezuela is much larger than Panama, which in itself is a very different kind of project. There are differences, obviously, in the state of the government in both countries. The oil reserves are, without any hidden rationale, being talked about very prominently by President Trump today. Hi, Don. And finally, I mean, they're very different kinds of administrations. And I want to add, there were many critics of Panama. And I think I might try to write something about that. It wasn't as if there was a consensus that when the U.S. did that, that was good. But the administration, I would argue, thanks, Ann, I'm just writing that down. The administration, I would argue today, is not whatever one thinks of different foreign policy issues and whatever your partisan stance, the Bush administration was filled with veterans of foreign policy in the State Department and the Pentagon. Bush himself had deep experience in foreign policy. And as controversial as that was and remains today, I think we're talking about a fundamentally different kind of administration dealing with a crisis. But it is very big. Others point to 1953 when the U.S. Was part of a covert coup against the democratically elected Iranian government. That also is very different in that it was a CIA secret operation to support a coup, as opposed to here, where it's as dramatic as it gets in capturing, and now putting on trial a foreign leader, and it remains unclear what kind of plan, if any, is in effect for what happens next. And as we've learned, certainly with the war in Iraq, if you don't have a what happens next, that can be extraordinarily dangerous and volatile situation. There's also, I think, with Venezuela instantly tapping into, we've heard conversations about the Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt Corollary, and a long controversial history of U.S. Interference in this region. And thanks, Just. So I think we are kind of looking and have to remember how loaded this is, and what this might mean for stability. It has implications vis-a-vis China, also, and so there's lots of questions historically that I think come up as a result of this. The final thing, which is kind of interesting, I mean, doing this through a legal process has certain implications as opposed to a military process, in that we don't know how the judge here in the United States ultimately will rule, and what will happen if the judge and the jury are not persuaded that the case is there. But those are all issues for the future, and raised a little earlier a question about Vietnam, and saying she's, I think, forgive me if I got it wrong, but Anne, that you're old enough to remember Vietnam and police actions. And I actually think that is really significant. I think that, I don't know your age, but if you're part of that baby boom cohort that in the 1970s and 80s was really shaped by Vietnam. Okay, I'm writing the questions so they come. Uh, the dog. I think there was during the 70s and 80s a lot more conscious resistance to these kinds of efforts. You certainly saw with the Carter administration very explicit efforts to heal relations in the region, even while remaining tough against tyrants and dictators. He tried to do this, President Carter, through the Panama Canal treaties. That was a very big part of the rationale for that policy decision. When President Reagan tried to increase assistance to the Nicaraguan Contras and to other forces in Central America, there was intense congressional resistance, including the Bolin amendments that passed between 1982 and 84, which restrict the ability of the administration to legally and explicitly provide assistance to the Contras, even though obviously they did it subversively, which becomes the heart of the Iran-Contra scandal. So I think that generation was very aware of the dangers of military operations, and when they were done either without proper justification or without proper planning. Also, morally, kind of without those questions being front and center. I do think the war in Iraq raised a lot of those concerns, and there is a certain irony that a lot of President Trump's initial support back in 2016 came from his ability to position himself against the Republican establishment, and his questions toward then Governor Jeb Bush about Bush's brother and the war in Iraq were really important. That was part of what America First connoted. It was a promise not to get into these kinds of situations. So that seems to have quickly faded. Lots of questions coming through. I think Kath raised the wag the dog question, which it has forever been on the minds of political observers, certainly since the movie came out in 1997. And I wrote about that film on one of my Longview newsletters from the history uh, books. And there are questions, and I don't think they should be discounted because President Trump does think about this attention economy, as it's called in politics. How do you gain and keep attention? How do you distract attention? And this comes at a time when Republicans clearly are struggling and worried about the midterms, as the president is. So there are going to be natural questions about why this, why now, how much this is a distraction, a political distraction, even if there are people in the administration like Secretary Rubio who have been pushing for this. And what does it do to the news cycle? I personally am not persuaded that this will sustain the attention, both of the media and the citizenry. And I do think there's a big danger, just politically, put aside all the other issues of international law and more. There is a danger that this kind of fuels a problem that President George H.W. Bush actually had, where many voters came to see him as someone just not interested in the domestic struggles of working Americans. Then it was a recession, and President Clinton capitalizes on that. President Trump has already been struggling with this issue in the last few months, for sure. And I think there's a way in which this doesn't become a distraction, but in fact adds to some of the very serious political problems that the GOP, not just he, is facing going into the midterms. And that raises another question. I believe Carol asked if somehow this becomes a justification for the administration to say that we are at war and somehow delay the midterm elections or other kinds of facilitate other kinds of interference as we head into the season. I would be foolhardy to say no, that is never going to happen. But I don't think that should be an assumption. And I think there would be, frankly, a lot of resistance to that. As much, and I've written about this, as serious as the ongoing threats have been to the integrity of the electoral system, something we should remember as we commemorate January 6th. Equally important have been those who have pushed back from courts to local and state officials to citizens. And I don't think that goes away. And it's not clear to me that this action in Venezuela becomes some kind of World War II mobilization that, or even World War I, that allows the president to take such strong arm actions. We need to remember very clearly the president faces historically low approval ratings. The Republicans have really been struggling at the ballot box, which should suggest to people that there are serious vulnerabilities based on an unhappiness with what the president has done. And I don't think this is just about affordability. I do think there is a democratic pulse in this country that has been uneasy at the least. Angry is another sentiment about the strong armed presidential moves that the White House has made. And so all of that can, again, be exacerbated by what is going on. So I think it's a fair comment to throw out there. The oil industry, what's really interesting is other moments like this when historians or journalists have written that the rationale behind an action is actually about interests, material interests. Very often, an administration pushes back against this and points to other justifications. You saw that with Operation Desert Storm, for example, in President Bush, where there were many people saying, opponents of those operations against Hussein back in 1990 and 91, saying what the U.S. really cared about was oil. There are memos in the Bush papers. I've seen them. There's some interesting memos where advisors openly talk about that and not hiding it as an interest, but still you go back and you listen to President George H.W. Bush, that's not what he would use to mobilize support and to justify the operations. Instead, it would be about democracy. Instead, it would be about geographic integrity. What's very different with President Trump, which fits into his in broad daylight approach to politics, is he's talking very openly about it. I have seen reports. I don't know what's true and not, and we need some time to parse through this about his conversation with oil companies and executives. But he's talked publicly about that commodity. Some of it is put in a geo kind of political question. Let me just write that question. Um, and some of it's just very open, where he's talking about not just having control of those oil reserves, which are very rich, but at the same time very difficult to use, which will be a challenge and a cost for the United States, again, at a moment when affordability is front and center, to paying for a lot of this via those oil reserves. So the explicit discussion that the president has put on this, putting it front and center, is quite stunning, I think, compared to what we've heard, at least on the surface, from previous administrations. In terms of the billionaire club, do they deem that the president has gone too far? Look, A, I don't think the billionaire club should not still be seen as cohesive as it might appear to be during the inauguration. I think historically what we see is wealthy Americans, corporate interests often do tend to fracture. They're not all aligned. They have very different interests. They're focused on different parts of the economy. There's very wealthy Americans who not just ethically, but economically are very vested in green energy and green jobs, for example, not happy with what the administration has done to cut back on all these kinds of initiatives, certainly will not be boasting about a lot of this oil focus for the administration. Corporations represent many different interests, and I think what we see historically is they often can split. And I do think you're seeing some of that already, although we focus on some high profile billionaires such as Jeff Bezos. There are many other wealthy Americans, I'm not sure, who are quite comfortable, certainly with tariffs. I suspect also with some of these kinds of operations, which can have a big cost. Are we a transactional? I didn't see who asked that. Let's see if I can get to that. Dave asked a number of really interesting questions. And look, I think, is this an illegal act and we need to stop normalizing the act? This is a question that comes up. And I think Just Dave, and I'm calling you Just Dave because it's there. Yeah, I mean, there's so many examples of where things as a historian that you see that are abnormal, that are shocking, truly shocking, become discussed in the national zeitgeist as just another event or normal is stunning. Again, we're coming on January 6th, which in my mind should be a centerpiece of any historical discussion, any conversation about where we are as a country. But I fear it's really not at this point. It's just another event for too many Americans. And I think with what we just saw today, with the U.S. government going in, taking a leader as horrendous as that leader might be, bringing him back to the United States without kind of clear justification, no congressional authorization at all, not even clear Congress knew that this was going to come. I'm sure we will learn more. Should be seen as a really stunning moment. And what I talk to people, and they'll tell me, what about Panama? Or what about Iran? Or what about the Bay of Pigs in 1961 when the U.S. tried to topple the Castro regime? And I look at those, and I when I hear that, I'm like, those are examples of why this is so shocking, not why it's normal. Just because there are instances in American history of the government taking these kinds of actions, sometimes that comparison just amplifies. Sorry about my dog. Just amplifies how kind of stunning what we are seeing actually is today. So I agree, and I do think there's a danger of normalization, and that doesn't mean every conversation has to be sensational about the administration, but we need level-headed clarity about when you are seeing uses of presidential power and executive action that go really beyond the boundaries of what the founders envisioned and what most of American history, not all of it for sure, there is a long history of these kinds of operations show. And I think having that discussion, just Dave, is quite important. And I'm glad that you brought. And I think people start having it. I do think that's why history is really useful, frankly. This is an aside, but I mean, the history is useful to kind of mark when you see something in 2026. Happy New Year, by the way, to everyone. In 2026, that is fundamentally different than what we've seen. History is also useful to see when something that administration does or when something that Congress does fits into kind of a bad pattern that we've had in American history. You know, I talk about this with race, for example. Um, I'm sorry, I'm just writing the question down. You know, you see it with race, and it's important to understand just how severe kind of the history of racial injustice and racial violence has been in this country. You need to understand that, and then you see events happen today. The point is this worse or is not? Is this worse or the same or less bad? The point is this is tapping into something fundamental, and I think with Venezuela you can make that argument that both this is dramatic and this is kind of a new level of what a president can do. And at the same time, it fits into this problem we have had certainly since the Cold War of presidents using executive power, Congress not being forceful enough in overseeing the use of that power to take action. Eventually, it gets bigger and bigger in terms of the ambitions of what a president would do. Once again, if you look back and look at old newspapers, for example, with old newspapers with the Panama moment, there were critics. Charlie Rangel, for example, a member of Congress, or Don Edwards, a member of Congress from California, were saying if you do this, a future president will do something even bigger, and you're gradually losing any kind of grounding and limitation on what a president can do. This was the argument after Vietnam, too. You needed war powers, not because it wasn't a pacifist argument that war is always bad, but there needs to be checks, there needs to be balance, there needs to be pushback when a president wants to take military action. Otherwise, you're in a dangerous scenario where you are being led by a chorus of one. And look, as we're in the 250th anniversary of the Declaration, a declaration that was rooted in these kinds of arguments, warnings about centralized power, warnings about excessive, authority in the executive branch. Here we are, and we are seeing that play out. I think with Venezuela, and can't remember who asked, maybe Lynn. There's lots of collateral damage in us forgetting and losing the ability to gauge all of what is happening and to put it into perspective. One scenario of the back to Vietnam is you have outrage and division over issues. A second scenario, which we don't talk about as much, is you have apathy, not with everyone, but with many people, and a lack of cognition. And so I think that is also a really kind of big danger because it lays a precedent, not just for the current administration, but future administrations to do the same. We take a break before we get to our final questions. Thank you, Andrea, for that. Um, Thank you to all my subscribers. We're starting a new year of office hours and tomorrow in the classroom and much more. I'm full of energy. And I am going to, as one journalist once said, if you have some sort of platform, use it. And I want to use it to continue bringing historical perspective and long term understanding of what is going on and some kind of thoughtful conversation as opposed to some of the hot takes you hear. So, thank you to all the subscribers. Thank you to paid subscribers. You are really the way I can keep doing this and doing it at a pace that brings you great content. And if some of you who are free subscribers will consider being paid subscribers, just hit that button. It really is important. I have a lot of books, but I don't have some big team, and I'm doing this on my own to make it all happen and to ensure high quality products. So thank you for paid subscribers, and thank you for those of you who switch over to that and offer your support to the program. Will there be an effort? I'm losing the names. Oh, Andrea. Thank you, Andrea, on war powers. I don't know. I mean, it's easy to say Congress will never do that, but you could have said that in 1972, a year before Congress did that, in the wake of Richard Nixon and the revelation of the Cambodia bombing. There are moments; they are far and few between. They're rare. It's not just today where Congress reforms itself; it reforms other institutions, and we had that in the mid 70s. From 73 to 78 is a high point in political reform. Some of it's worked, some of it has not. It ranged from war powers to ethics reforms. And I don't know. I do think, there's lots of natural debates about who should be the next Democratic nominee, who will have power after the midterms. But I think you also have to have a conversation about, can we enter into a period where we actually take the way institutions work seriously, like we did in the 70s, like we did in the progressive era. Those kinds of reforms are absolutely essential when you reach these problematic hot points in American history, because they change the rules of the game regardless of which party has power, and regardless of what the immediate concerns are. The War Powers Act certainly failed on many levels. I do think it did still put pressure for requesting resolutions of support until now. I think other reforms, campaign finance, mixed record, some of it worked. Contribution limits had a good effect, I think, and the public finance system we had until Bush and Obama for presidential elections was quite good. Parts of the ethics reforms have created much better disclosure than we used to have. So reform can work. Obviously, the direct election of senators back in the progressive era was hugely consequential. Voting rights reforms in the 60s, a little different period, were very important. So the point is, I hope we can have those conversations as well. They are often not as sexy, so to speak, but they are really integral. And I think we are at a kind of tipping point with presidential power, some of which President Trump has done. Again, as many feel with Venezuela, but part of it is his exploiting situations the U.S. has allowed to happen, and other presidents have been more reluctant to deploy the power than he is, but he's doing it. So we need a moment like the 70s where reform becomes a centerpiece of the legislative debate rather than just another issue or a secondary issue. Anyway, Happy New Year, everyone. Thanks for coming, and we have office hours underway in 2026. We're certainly going to have a lot to talk about. Hope you enjoy that foreign policy piece. Hope tomorrow you enjoy my newsletter and all the conversations later this week. Thank you again, and talk to you all soon. Bye bye.